Welcome back, everybody. Our next guest is joining us to discuss a difficult but important topic, mental health and violence. Is there a connection between violent behavior and mental illness? And if so, why is there a connection? Let's answer all these questions with Dr. Rochelle Head Dunham from Metropolitan Human Services District. Welcome back, Doctor.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on to talk about this because, you know, I first want to start with like debunking this idea that maybe some people have about mental illness. Here's my question for you. Are people with mental illness more likely to be violent?
Absolutely not. In fact, people with mental illness, particularly severe mental illness, are more likely to be victims of violence. The violence, there are two types of violence. There is violence perpetrated against other people, and there's violence perpetrated against yourself. Mentally ill people are more likely to harm themselves. 50% of the time, suicidal behavior is associated with a mental illness diagnosis, but not homicidal behavior.
Wow.
97% of the time, no history of a diagnosed mental illness.
That is a powerful stat, too. And I also want to talk about a stat from 2017. 4% of crimes in the U.S. are committed by people with a mental illness?
Yeah, the 4%, but we like to focus on the 96%.
Come
That's
on,
not,
come
okay?
on.
But yeah, and in those cases, you're talking about a person who has probably bipolar disorder, which has a lot of impulsivity associated with it, but it's often co-occurring with substance use disorder, with alcohol being number one. Within a few days of drinking, people are most at risk of harming somebody else because of that impulsivity, but multiple drug use also is a risk factor. Now, those are considered psychiatric conditions, substance use disorders, but not mental illness like major depression, schizophrenia, those kinds of things. Those people are less likely to commit violence, but you couple substance use with trauma,
Psychological
and
stressors.
Stressors, because that's what trauma is. Contextual environmental things that make it difficult to live, like social determinants of health,
Right.
like ACEs. You put all of that together, you've got a pot brewing for violence.
And that's so sad. And I'm sure that there's also some studies shown that different ages, your sex, maybe a lot of things, really, the community you grow up in, those are all also factors. Talk to me about how age, sex, and race plays into it.
They are, absolutely. And it's hard to talk about homicidal behavior without talking about suicidal behavior, right? So if you look at suicidal behavior is most likely to occur in older white men who have probably retired and had their lives have sunned, they've had a lot of losses, and they've not reinstituted a social connection for them. They are the highest risk factors for committing suicide. But the problem we're seeing is that suicides are increasing amongst black kids. That was never an issue before. And the belief there is that it has a lot to do with those adverse childhood experiences, the trauma that they're exposed to, racial issues. All of those things create a cooking pot, a melting pot for young people more likely to commit violence. Now, what is also true, I want to dispel this myth as well, the majority of people who commit violent crimes are not young kids. And it's definitely not young black boys.
Why do you think people believe that? Is it because they're seeing it, just out there? Or what do you think the cause of people thinking that it's younger people committing these crimes when it's not?
Well, you know, the media is huge. Media portrays things the way they want it portrayed, and we are susceptible to what's on TV. We believe it's there, it has to be true.
Right.
And so the sensationalism around these crimes that these young kids are committing is what's being promoted. You don't see as much with the 35 plus people who are committing crimes, but they're the largest group that's actually committing crimes, gun violence related crimes, homicidal crimes. It's not the children.
Right.
It's not.
It's
The
so
children
true.
are victims of the choices we make as adults, the environments we put them in, and ultimately their ability to learn how to do pro-social things, how to control difficult situations, even situations with their peers, is an unlearned skill for them.
It's so true. And I'm glad you mentioned the media part because it's so true. Media is so powerful. And that's why I'm glad that on this show we get to have conversations like this so people can understand in their own life how they may be affected by something like this. But look, at the end of the day, we all know that this needs to get better. This needs to be debunked. And you all have this really interesting thing that you all like to talk about. Upstream primary prevention. Talk to me about what this is.
Yes, and that's about postvention prevention. So two things have to happen. You have to be in front of this on the front end before it happens, and you have to be in on the back end when it does happen. So you have to surround it by preventative efforts. The post-vention primary prevention is recognizing what are the risk factors and address it now before the act occurs. So if a person has had a history of violence, you're doing the appropriate querying, right? Primary care doctors should be asking some questions about those adverse childhood experiences and referring young people or adults who carry that into adulthood to the appropriate agencies like a metropolitan that treats those conditions. On the back end, when the violence happens, there has to be psychological first aid on the spot to make sure that the emotionality around that is properly addressed, because a lot of times violence is a copycat behavior.
Come on.
And so, especially with kids, but adults too. And so this is where media is problematic. If you're promoting stories that are very detailed about how this happened, what they did, and you are informing some people too about what they can do and how they can do it. That is not primary prevention. That is actually creating more adverse behavior for people who are there.
And that's why I think it's so important to have a conversation, especially with the holidays here. A lot of families are going to be getting together. Look at your family, see what maybe might be causing us to feel certain ways. And Dr. Dunham, always a great time having you here. We matched today, by the way. Thank you for this very important conversation. And look, if you want more information about mental health or the topic that we talked about today, log on to mhsdla.org for more information. All right, coming